On the morning of June 4th, 1942, a Japanese naval officer named Minoru Genda stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi and watched the first wave of American dive bombers appear out of the cloud cover above him. What he watched in the next 9 minutes changed everything he believed about what this war was going to look like. In those 9 minutes, American SBD dauntless dive bombers put fatal bombs into 3 of the 4 fleet carriers that formed the offensive core of the Japanese naval air arm. The Kaga, the Soryu, and the Akagi herself, the very ship on which Genda was standing, were turned into burning wreckage. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, survived the initial attack long enough to put bombs into the American carrier Yorktown before American aircraft found it that afternoon and finished the job. By nightfall on June 4th, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and the most experienced concentration of naval aviators it possessed, all in a single afternoon over a small atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway. The story of how that happened is not simply a story about naval tactics or the bravery of American airmen, though it is also both of those things. It is the story of a more fundamental shift in the balance of the war, a shift that had been building for months before a single bomb fell, and that would continue to accelerate for 3 more years until the last Japanese officer signed his name on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. What also deserves recognition, though it rarely appears in most accounts, is what American intelligence had already accomplished before the carriers left Pearl Harbor, and what one underpaid Navy cryptanalyst working in a basement in Hawaii had determined about the Japanese operational plan 2 weeks before the Japanese fleet ever left port. The man's name was Joseph Rochefort. He was a naval officer who had spent years learning the Japanese language and studying Japanese naval communications, and by the spring of 1942, he was running a unit called Station Hypo, which was the cryptanalysis operation attached to the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. In the weeks before Midway, Rochefort's team had broken enough of the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25, to determine that the Japanese were planning a major operation against a target they called AF, and that this operation was scheduled for early June. The problem was that Washington's own intelligence analysts disagreed with Rochefort's identification of AF as Midway. He devised a test. He arranged for the Midway garrison to transmit an uncoded radio message reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down. Washington accepted the identification. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, ordered his 3 available carriers into position northeast of Midway to wait. The 3 carriers he had were the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, and the Yorktown should not technically have been there at all. She had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea the previous month, and had arrived at Pearl Harbor on May 27th, with damage that naval engineers initially assessed would require 3 months of dry dock repairs. Nimitz told them they had 72 hours. Working around the clock in 3 shifts, 1,400 dockyard workers repaired enough of the Yorktown's internal structure that she was able to steam out of the Pearl Harbor on May 30th, still carrying repair crews who finished their work at sea. What Nagumo did not know was that American codebreakers had handed Nimitz something no amount of additional carriers could have replaced, which was the precise location, timing, and composition of the Japanese attack. The Americans were not reacting to the Japanese, they were waiting for them. The air attacks began on the morning of June 4th, and the first hours went badly for the Americans. The initial torpedo bomber attacks, conducted by slow and poorly armed TBD Devastators flying without fighter escort, were slaughtered by Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of the 41 Devastators that launched attacks that morning, only 6 returned to their carriers. They attacked anyway, and in doing so they pulled the Japanese combat air patrol fighters down to low altitude at precisely the moment that the American dive bomber squadrons arrived at high altitude above the Japanese fleet, with no fighters between them and their targets. The dive-bombing attacks lasted less than 10 minutes. The Kaga took 4 bomb hits and began burning uncontrollably within minutes. The Soryu took 3 bombs in rapid succession and was abandoned by her crew before noon. The Akagi took only 1 bomb, but it penetrated to the hangar deck where fully fueled and armed aircraft were being prepared for a second strike, and the resulting secondary explosions made her impossible to save. A Japanese destroyer torpedoed her at the order of her own admiral that night. The Hiryu, which had escaped to the north during the initial attacks, launched 2 strike waves that afternoon that damaged the Yorktown severely enough that she was later finished off by a Japanese submarine. But American aircraft found the Hiryu before sunset and put 4 bombs in her that left her burning through the night. By the morning of June 5th, the Japanese had no operational fleet carriers remaining in the area. Nagumo's entire carrier striking force, the same force that had executed Pearl Harbor and ranged across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean for 6 months without a serious defeat, had ceased to exist as a functional unit. Japan would build new carriers over the next 2 years, but it would never again assemble the combination of ships and experienced aviators that had made the Kido Butai the most dangerous naval force on Earth. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,500 men, including many of its most skilled and irreplaceable naval aviators. The strategic consequences of Midway were visible almost immediately. 2 months later, in August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands, marking the first major American amphibious offensive operation of the Pacific War. The decision to attack at Guadalcanal was driven by intelligence reports that Japan was constructing an airfield on the island from which land-based aircraft could threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. The Marines who went ashore on August 7th seized the unfinished airstrip within hours and immediately began the work of completing it. They named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. What followed was 6 months of some of the most ferocious fighting of the entire Pacific campaign, conducted simultaneously on land, at sea, and in the air above a tropical island. The Japanese responded to the American landing with a series of naval counterattacks and overland infantry assaults that pushed the Marine perimeter to its limits. 7 major naval engagements were fought in the waters around Guadalcanal, and the Americans did not win all of them. The Iron Bottom Sound, the strait between Guadalcanal and Florida Island, took its name from the ships of both navies that went to the bottom there during those months of fighting. The Japanese lost approximately 25,000 men on Guadalcanal. American losses were around 7,000 killed. When the last Japanese troops were evacuated from the island in February 1943, the strategic initiative in the entire South Pacific had permanently shifted to the United States. The instrument of the American advance that followed was a concept that American planners called island hopping, and the essential insight behind it was that Japan's defensive perimeter in the Pacific was too large and too thinly spread to be attacked everywhere simultaneously. Rather than reducing every fortified Japanese position in the Pacific, American commanders would concentrate their available resources against strategically selected objectives, bypass heavily defended positions entirely, and use air and submarine power to sever the supply lines, keeping bypassed Japanese garrisons alive. The Marines who fought at Tarawa in November 1943 paid an extraordinary price in 76 hours of fighting that killed more than 1,000 Americans on a coral island barely 3 miles long, but the Hau'i-Gilbert Islands campaign that Tarawa was part of opened the door to the Marshall Islands, which opened the door to the Marianas, which put American B-29 bombers within reach of Tokyo itself. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was the moment at which Japan's ability to contest American control of the Central Pacific effectively ended. The Japanese launched 9 separate airstrikes against the American carrier task force off Saipan. American fighter pilots, flying the new F-6F Hellcat, which had been designed specifically to outperform the Zero, and guided to their intercepts by shipboard radar that the Japanese did not yet have an equivalent of, destroyed 243 Japanese aircraft on June 19th alone. Japan lost more than 300 aircraft across 2 days of fighting, along with 3 carriers sunk, and a 4th so badly damaged it was finished off by American submarines. American aircraft losses were 130. The disparity was not a matter of courage. It was a matter of training pipelines and production capacity that Japan had never possessed and could not now replace. Saipan fell in July 1944, after 3 weeks of fighting that killed more than 29,000 of the island's 30,000 Japanese defenders. The fall of Saipan brought B-29 superfortresses within 1,500 miles of Tokyo and directly caused the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, whose entire strategic conception had rested on the assumption that Japan's island defensive perimeter would hold. On February 19, 1945, the 5th Marine Division and the 4th Marine Division landed on a small volcanic island 8 miles long and 4 miles wide, roughly 700 miles south of Tokyo, called Iwo Jima. The 21,000 Japanese troops defending it had spent months constructing an underground network of tunnels, bunkers, and mutually supporting firing positions that covered every beach approach, every open ridgeline, and every likely avenue of American advance. For 36 days, American Marines fought through that network position by position, and when the island was declared secured on March the 26th, approximately 6,800 Americans were dead and more than 17,000 wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, 1,038 were taken prisoner. The rest were dead. The final land battle of the Pacific War began on April 1, 1945, when American forces landed on Okinawa, 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. It would last 82 days and produce the highest casualty figures of any campaign in the Pacific theater. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and an estimated 100,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle. American ground forces suffered 12,000 killed and nearly 37,000 wounded. The United States Navy, facing thousands of kamikaze attacks, suffered almost 10,000 sailors killed or wounded, with 30 ships sunk and 368 damaged. The battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, was intercepted by American aircraft on April 7th, while sailing toward Okinawa on a one-way mission with barely enough fuel to reach the island. American carrier planes found her 200 miles north of Okinawa and sank her in 2 hours with 11 torpedo hits and 6 bomb strikes.